Okay, so I think people would benefit perhaps from hearing a bit about the history of this. So, historically in common law, there's been a very direct link between, speech that could potentially be criminalized and an actual act of violence. So the way that J.S. Mill famously puts this is that an opinion that corn dealers are starvers of the poor that's fine if it's just put in a pamphlet or a newspaper somewhere. But the point at which it becomes criminal is when someone says this out loud to an angry mob, which outside the corn dealership, which then proceeds to go and burn it down. And that can be said, reasonably can be said to have materially contributed to that act of violence that followed. But now, obviously, we seem to be moving to this situation where it's not direct acts of violence that are necessarily precipitated by this speech, but rather subjective emotions like hate or like distress and things like that. So, how have we moved between these two understandings of what's criminal speech?
Well, I think one of the things that's happened is governments have lost confidence in the ability of their citizens to rationally debate, argue, contest, dissent from certain forms of speech. So I think the threshold has been lowered from the idea that, the point of intervention should come when violent action is imminent or when somebody is inciting violence. And now what they're saying is, well, actually, perhaps even just having some form of claim in a newspaper, on social media, that someone somewhere might weaponize to bring about many stages down the line, violent action might be brought about. Shouldn't we really be intervening at that stage to stop that whole chain of events from taking place? And I think as that happens, what we've really seen with governments, I say that they've lost confidence in their citizens. Another way of putting that was that increasingly they're enthralled to a form of behaviorist thinking about people and about how people respond to external stimuli.
And so there's no longer that direct link between, speech and a crime, but rather speech that's sort of contributing to certain emotions. And in fact, the way that first comes into British law is with the 1965 Race Relations Act. And the particular offence there is something along the lines of inculcating in the mind of another person a feeling of hatred towards a particular racial or ethnic group, something like that at least. And so how do you define that hate? And crucially, this hate here is sort of asserted to be linked in some way to lawless action, but the link is much less clearly defined than we had in our mill example with the corn dealers. And this says to me that these kinds of laws are linked to the sort of behaviorism you were talking about, which is to say that the state kind of taking responsibility for its citizens' emotions almost.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're right. The phrase is inculcating in the mind of another person a feeling of hatred towards a particular racial or ethnic group. I mean, so inculcating in the mind. I mean, so one of the things about the behaviorism, behavioral psychology, and it has, it's taken over in terms of think tanks, the kind of policy research that's done in governmental circles, that there is no concept of the mind in behaviorism. What you have is inputs that will either condition people's behavior or they won't condition people's behavior. So how people think, how people reflexively interpret the information they're given is not really relevant. What you're wanting is an output. Are they going to behave in a different way to the way they might otherwise behave? Well, so into that vacuum where the idea of a thinking, cognitively rich citizen might have been, comes this fear about, can we trust people to actually react in a way that won't be immediate? If somebody says something inflammatory, can we possibly trust that these behavioural animals won't simply be immediately radicalised by this inflammatory talk? Of course, the other response would be to say that people debate, people argue, people fight back and argue back. People contest these claims. And the more that you allow inflammatory type of talk of that kind to be contested, the more it's weakened. But once you have this version of the human being as not being able to cope, as being easily radicalized by inputs into, where the mind used to be, and radicalize their behavior becomes radicalized by hearing these claims, inevitably your impulse as a government is going to say, well, we've got to legislate against this. We can't have people radicalizing others. We can't have them inculcating in the mind of other people, certain thoughts which down the line will lead to violence. You give up essentially on the idea of the autonomous, resilient, thinking citizen. And in its place comes this model, entirely false model, of somebody who can't cope and is vulnerable to radical messaging, inflammatory messaging, and won't argue back, won't contest that messaging. And we see it for the first time in the Race Relations Act, 1965. But I'm sure you, as well as I, Laurie, could cite legislation that's come since, where there's simply reduced to its bare philosophical bones. There's a lack of trust in the citizen that this form of speech might radicalize somebody. So therefore, we must curtail people's ability to talk or speak or communicate in those ways.
And so on that question of the lack of trust, so to begin with, there's this lack of trust in the sort of hater, if you like, not to be more radicalized by hearing hateful language. But at the same time, there's on the flip side of that, there's a lack of trust in the hatee, it seems, not to have kind of their entire sense of psychological stability crushed by hearing a few hurty words. And so you have these moves to regulate distress and offense and even harm online, right? And so, isn't that interesting that there's sort of a lack of trust in both sides of the equation here from the state that it feels it has to manage?
Yeah, you're vulnerable to these inputs. Some people fall apart, allegedly. Some people have, the therapy discourse kicks in about traumatic speech, harmful speech. And then, of course, on the other end of that spectrum is the radicalization. So some people might be particularly vulnerable to this type of speech, which will upset them and traumatize them, but others will be radicalized with it. But what in both instances, you don't have a conceptualization of the thinking, rational human being. What you essentially have is a stimulus that people are simply being conditioned by, and they're either traumatized by it or they're either radicalized by it. But there's a huge missing middle of people who contest, argue, debate, put counter arguments forward, and all too often, of course, into that vacuum. So once you curtail this type of speech, it doesn't go away, does it? It goes underground, and it gains more admirers and adherents because, of course, you in some way, by curtailing it, suppressing it, making it unlawful, you fuel that flame of suggesting, oh well, we've got a point because the state is running scared of the points that we would make, and they're scared that if we get these words out there and if we say these things, their whole edifice of their society will fall apart. But if people were actually allowed to say these things and then be shown up and ridiculed and during debate and argumentation and essentially ignored when the arguments that they put forward have been rebutted, there wouldn't be that lingering sense of kind of resentment and a lingering sense that actually we might be right with our inflammatory speech. We might be onto something here because the state won't let us say it.